At the Licks, a place of nourishment. It is a river, a geographic place, a site of inspiration and prosperity for the diverse peoples who have settled here. The Mahoning Valley has been the lifeblood of millions of people, who in turn enrich the valley and the nation. Our story, The Peopling of the Mahoning Valley, speaks of the countless contributions of those who benefited from the Mahoning, and then developed leadership for the Mahoning Valley and beyond. Originally, the Mahoning Valley area was the territory of Indians. The first European settlers arrived to the Mahoning area in the late 1700s and clustered around what is now Warren. Most notable were James Hillman, an agent for a Pittsburgh trading company, and John Young, surveyor entrepreneur of New York State, for whom Youngstown was named. In 1796, Young signed a purchase agreement and later purchased with $16,085 of borrowed money 15,560 acres from the Connecticut Land Company for Township 2, Range 2 of the Connecticut Western Reserve. Young and two surveying parties, which included Daniel Sheehy, Phineas Hill, and later James Hillman, spent time from 1796 to 1797 in the Mahoning Valley, laying out what became Youngstown Township. Shortly afterward, many English settled in the region. Some quickly distinguished themselves. Family names such as Arms, Baldwin, Adams, Hitchcock, Kirkland, Rudge, Wick, Williamson, and Boardman were among the first Europeans to benefit from the Mahoning. They established Canfield and Youngstown, which served successively as the county seat. Struthers, named for John Struthers, was soon settled as a mill town at the mouth of Yellow Creek. 50 years after its inception on July 7, 1846, William Pritchard was the first Englishman in the Mahoning County to become a naturalized citizen. John Davis of the Western Reserve Land Company was the first of the Welsh to locate in the valley in 1807. Davis recruited other Welsh immigrants to come to the Mahoning to mine coal, resulting in substantial numbers of Welsh by the 1830s and 1840s. The Scots who came to this area arrived either directly from their homeland or by way of Canada. They too were miners or iron workers, such as William Henderson, whose grandson was to serve as mayor of Youngstown in the 1940s and 50s. Among the first Irish to settle the Mahoning in the 1830s were Daniel Sheehy and the four Anderson brothers, John, David, Joseph, and Robert. Their letters to Ireland told of their new land and prosperity realized by the hard work digging canal ditches or mill sites or of working on farms. After Ireland's potato famine of the 1840s, the early Irish settlers were joined by a swell of their countrymen. By 1860, they were well settled in Briar Hill, Vinegar Hill, now Sheehy Street, Bottle Hill off Albert Street, Smoky Hollow just south of YSU, Kilkenny along Poland Avenue, and in Jackson Township. The first naturalized citizen of Irish birth in Mahoning County was Matthew Kilpatrick, September 7, 1846. Often because of their Catholicism, large families, and alleged drinking and brawling, the Irish were ill-treated and were not hired for the better jobs. Also among the first to settle in the Mahoning were a small number of Germans. They came in increasingly large numbers during the mid-1800s. By then, 116 of the 658 Youngstown residents were of German background. Some early German immigrants were farmers and settled in Green Township, drawn by the excellent farmlands. Often accused of being clannish or drinking excessively, they sometimes experienced bigotry and discrimination. By the second half of the century, many distinguished themselves in diverse occupations and careers. Noteworthy are the family names of Dybel, Renner, Mogg, Stambaugh, Renner, Strauss, Hirschberg, and Lanterman. The Scandinavians, as the English, Welsh, Scots, Irish, and Germans, are considered among the older immigrants. By the late 1870s, they had established a significant presence in a small enclave in the Hazelton area. Among the significant names are Gustav and Alfred Hammer, Peter Jensen, and Scholten Harson. Generally well received by the larger population, the Scandinavians sometimes met the same derision and prejudice as the Irish and Germans before them. These were the early settlers that shaped the economic growth, social maturing, and political developments of the new community. Their geographic location was ideal for industry and community building. As part of the Mahoning River system that drains south into the Ohio River, the Mahoning Valley was connected by a portage to the Cuyahoga River, which flowed north into Lake Erie. The site was only 70 miles from Cleveland on Lake Erie to the north, and Pittsburgh at the headwaters of the Ohio to the south. The area had an abundance of wood, limestone, iron ore, and coal, the four basic ingredients for making iron and steel. It didn't take long for the ambitious new residents of the Mahoning area to capitalize on this unique and profitable combination of resources. Only a few years after Youngstown's founding, Daniel and James Heaton built Ohio's first blast furnace on Yellow Creek Gorge in Poland Township, now Struthers. This Hopewell furnace operated for about 4 years, after which James Heaton built and operated the Maria furnace in Niles in 1813. Isaac Heaton built Mill Creek furnace in Youngstown Township, behind what is now Pioneer Pavilion. The Mahoning Valley was on its way to being referred to as the Steel Valley, or simply the Valley. It was along the banks of the Mahoning and Yellow Creek that a major steel industry was to grow. Eventually, it formed an American rival to the Ruhr Valley in Germany. The region required only a means of transportation and distribution of goods. Until the Civil War, man-made interconnecting waterways were the valley's transportation solution to economic prosperity. The canal built through Youngstown in 1839 gave the Mahoning Valley an all-water route to both Cleveland and Pittsburgh. However, canal and river traffic had inherent problems: high cost, slow speed, and seasonal use in cold northern states. It was hard for the canal system to compete with the glamour of the mighty Iron Horse. Railroads began to replace the canals by the time of the Civil War. The first railroads, the Cleveland and Mahoning, reached the valley by 1856, thanks to David Todd, one of the steel industry pioneers and Ohio's 25th governor. Todd's entrepreneurship and visibility helped him make a fortune in coal, iron, and transportation. Several other local railroads were built during the remaining part of the century, but most of the railroad business was handled by the Pennsylvania and Lake Erie, the Erie and Lackawanna, the Pennsylvania and the Baltimore and Ohio. These lines fanned out to form a spoke, with 50 to 60 passenger trains steaming through the valley daily. More rail cars passed under the Center Street Bridge per day than any other location in the country. Charcoal and later raw coal, both abundant in the area, were used for smelting iron and eventually for manufacturing steel. In fact, coal was so abundant that it was exported to the east, even to England. This spurred Youngstown's economic growth, so that by 1870 it was the third largest city of Ohio in terms of manufacturing revenue. By the eve of the Civil War, Lake Superior iron ore, as well as local pockets of ore, were found to be excellent for use in a blast furnace. This further accelerated the area's growth. The Mahoning Valley was already an iron manufacturing center, and during the war was an important source of munitions. The demand for arms increased the price of iron enormously. Bar iron sold for $67 a ton in 1855, $95 by 1863, and $168 by 1865. Enormous profits were made in the iron industry during the Civil War, profits to build the steel industry of the valley in the 1890s. With the introduction of the Bessemer and open hearth methods of steel manufacturing, the cost of steel per ton fell from $300 to $30. Now steel could be used for railroad rails and structural steel buildings. Most of the more than 20 blast furnaces that dotted the valley in the post-Civil War era were along the Mahoning River. By 1895, investors pooled capital to build the first basic steel-producing plant in the Mahoning Valley. Consolidation in the late 1890s was brisk, as the United States Steel Corporation absorbed by merger about one-half of the Valley steel plants, and others merged to form the Republic Iron and Steel Company, which remained in Youngstown until 1936. The profits of the Civil War created fortunes for some local residents, who used the capital to finance yet more steel ventures. With the money, and arguably the best iron and steel workers in the country, two more companies were soon formed. The Youngstown Iron, Sheet, and Tube Company in 1900, and Sharon Steel soon thereafter. By the early 20th century, valley skylines were dominated by these steel giants. Even as the giants polluted the river, the same Mahoning nourished and enriched the valley. Other local industries mushroomed. Retail establishments, hotels, insurance companies, banks, telephone, gas, and electric companies were established. The first bank, Wick Brothers and Company, formed in 1857, became the Wick National Bank in 1894. The Youngstown Savings and Loan Association, founded in 1868, became the Mahoning National Bank 9 years later. The Commercial National Bank was founded in 1880. And so the early settlers came to the Mahoning to be nourished and to enrich. By 1880, the city had grown to a population of 15,435, nearly double that of 1870. Federal Street was the main commercial thoroughfare and remained so for 100 years. Incandescent lighting was introduced when the G.M. McKelvey Company installed a private light plant. Later, the North Avenue Power Plant provided electricity for Youngstown, Sharon, Wheatland, Mill Creek Park, and the Fall Street car line. The telephone was introduced into the valley in 1880, and by 1915, automatic dialing had reached the area. Automobiles were being seen on the valley streets by the turn of the century, and sparked the construction of durable bridges that extended the living space for those who wanted less urban settings. The Market Street Viaduct was opened in 1899, transforming a country road into a thriving commercial street. Other bridges were built to cross the Mahoning River at South Avenue, Mahoning Avenue, and one connecting the South Side and East Youngstown, the Center Street Bridge. After the Civil War, Southern and Central Europeans were lured to the Mahoning. Italians and Slovaks came in the 1870s, followed shortly by the Polish. The construction of the first steel mill in the early 1890s promised work, wealth, and happiness for the immigrant Romanians, Croatians, Greeks, Slovenians, Hungarians, Ukrainians, Austrians, Russians, and Jews. Between 1900 and 1920, this wave of new immigrants helped triple the population of Youngstown, now at more than 132,000. A majority of those who labored in the mills came from the new immigration. This new immigrant labor was a major force in rapidly changing the Mahoning Valley from a rural agrarian to a full-blown urban industrial society. Small businesses, notably the garment industry, were given great impetus by the Jews. To a surprising degree, the Italians, as the Irish before, rose rapidly from pick and shovel work to more skilled trades, and from boot blacking and peddling and barbering to more pretentious business enterprises. Once again, ethnic mixes sometimes created new ethnic tensions. As important as these new groups were, they were blamed for the increase in crime, for drinking excessively, for having a high illiteracy rate. All mobs were described as foreign mobs, made up of foreign scum, beer-smelling Germans, ignorant Bohemians, uncouth Poles, wild-eyed Russians. The new immigrants were referred to as beaten men from a beaten race, biologically incapable of rising either now or through their descendants above the mentality of a 12-year-old child. Such beliefs fostered the growth of such bigoted groups as the Ku Klux Klan. These determined new immigrants disprove such ominous predictions. From the first Italians, John Gentile, Stefano Colucci, and Marco Antonelli. The first Greeks, George and James Chilakas. The first Hungarians, John Bacardi and Abraham Prince. The first Polish, Christian Kinson, Frank Zawadzki and Joseph Potaka. The first Ukrainians, Stefan Matko and George Glizy, to the thousands who followed. The new immigrants moved into every walk of life. Many distinguished themselves as they were nourished by the Mahoning. Enclaves or ghettos helped the new immigrants maintain their ethnic identity and live close to where they worked, often near the Mahoning River next to steel mills. The Croatians lived near Federal Street and Covington Street, where they helped lay the first pavement and streetcar tracks on Federal Street, and also cut down corn and wheat fields to make way for the steel mills. The Polish and Slovaks settled in the Steelton district, West Side, near South Side, Briar Hill, and East Youngstown, now Camel. The Russians in the Albert Street area and Camel. The Greeks in Camel, the Hungarians in the Briar Hill area, and Romanians in Camel and the near South Side. African Americans arrived in the valley in 1831, when Melinda Knight's family first settled here. A migration from the South during the World War I era saw the African American population grow as they came to work in the mills. However, the promises made to them were often not fulfilled, and many returned to the South, often feeling unwelcome to the valley. Nonetheless, many made important contributions. Some of the city's major buildings were designed and built by black tradesmen. P. Ross Berry and Lemuel Stewart built the Dollar Savings and Trust Company, now National City Bank Building. Berry built the original Rains School and the First Presbyterian Church. Todd Hotel and the First Baptist Temple on Front Street were also built by Berry and Stewart. The valley was continually enriched with families, homes, churches, skyscrapers, hospitals, schools, newspapers, libraries, cultural establishments, and parks. Beautiful homes were built along the Wick Avenue corridor. The Arms, the Wicks, and the Bonnells built mansions, some of which stand today. The churches reflected the various religious life that new and old immigrants brought with them. St. Columba's Cathedral, First Presbyterian Church, St. John's Episcopal Church, Pilgrim Collegiate, representing the Irish, the Welsh, the English, and some Germans, St. Joseph's for German Catholics. Orthodox and Byzantine Catholic churches dotted the city with their onion-domed steeples. Synagogues were built, beginning with Road of Shalom. Blacks built their churches with the Third Baptist Church, Oak Hill AME, and St. Mary's AME Zion Church at the turn of the century. The first skyscrapers marked the building boom at the turn of the century. The Dollar Bank Building, Charles H. Owsley's masterpiece, was started in 1901 and completed in 1906. The Stambaugh Building, designed by Albert Kahn, was built in 1910. The building boom crested in the 1920s with the construction of a number of skyscrapers, reflecting the influence of H. Richardson, Louis Sullivan, and Daniel Burnham. Other buildings of substance began to spring up on Federal Street. One of the older buildings became part of Lustig's shoe store, which also, in the late 1880s, hosted the YMCA reading rooms. It was here that the first night classes were held, the beginnings of Youngstown State University. The first hospital was started with a contribution from John Stambaugh in the form of 2.5 acres of land on Oak Hill Avenue and $10,000. The South Side unit of the Youngstown Hospital Association was located on the same location on Oak Hill until the late 1990s. St. Elizabeth's Hospital had its beginnings when 2 houses on Belmont Avenue were joined, and the first patient was admitted on December 8, 1911. Education and literacy were keys to success for many of the new and old immigrants. Schools proliferated as the population grew. And as the need for the Americanization process became more important, primary schools and high schools were built throughout the city. Newspapers began in the valley in 1843 with the publication of the Olive Branch and the New County Advocate. It was succeeded by a number of others, but only 2 survived. The Telegram and Vindicator, purchased by William F. Mogg in 1888, marking a long family association with the newspaper. Youngstown was also the center of many ethnic newspapers. Beginning in the 1870s, the Mahoning Library Association was formed. The public library was opened in 1891 on Federal Street near Central Square, later built on the site of the present courthouse, and finally on the current site in 1910, named for Reuben McMillan, to honor a pioneer Youngstown educator whose personal library formed the nucleus of the new county library. The varied cultures of the valley and the growing middle class gave a broad base for the new cultural activities of the Mahoning. Concerts and plays were offered in Excelsior Hall as early as 1869. With the opening of the Opera House in February 1874, operas, balls, and mass meetings were added. The Opera House was to be the center of the social and cultural life of the valley for the next 50 years. Live, legitimate theater in the form of the Park Theater was the local venue for leading thespians, opera companies, and vaudeville performers. At other locations, Iona Reynolds, an African-American, organized the Little Theater Guilds, wrote and directed minstrels, and presented shows in the early 1920s and 1930s. Even today, a live theater tradition, born in the 1920s on Lincoln Avenue, continues in the form of the Youngstown Playhouse, at its site since 1959 off Glenwood Avenue. With the coming of movies and the decline of the legitimate theater and opera, downtown Youngstown became dotted with movie theaters. The Palace, the Paramount, and the Warner were among the most elegant. Only one still stands as an icon to an age of eloquence long gone, the Warner, dedicated in 1931 by one-time Valley residents, the Warner Brothers. The Mahoning Valley has been part of what professional musicians call the music belt. The German and Welsh groups had a strong music tradition. The Youngstown Manicore was founded in 1863, Eistenfotts in 1871, and Sangerfests in 1879. Brass bands flourished. The Radiant Star Council No. 12 OVAM came out with a developed and properly attired band in 1872. Pasquarella's band was widely known in the Mahoning Valley. A short-lived symphonic orchestra known as the Mahoning Orchestra was formed in 1895, with other short-term ventures in 1917 and 1920. What is now known as the Youngstown Symphony has its origin with first-generation Italian-Americans Michael and Carmine Ficocelli's Youngstown Little Symphony Orchestra in 1932. Soon after, under the sponsorship of the Junior Chamber of Commerce, the Youngstown Symphony Society was fully launched. Concerts were held in the Stambaugh Auditorium until 1969, when Powers Auditorium became the Symphonies. In these early years of the 20th century, that which most impressed the casual visitor, next to the steel mills, was the extensive park system. The Mahoning Park System, within the reach of most area inhabitants, was and is used extensively by residents of the entire valley. The most impressive of all is the long, narrow Mill Creek Park, which begins in the center of the city and winds more than 10 miles south. Mill Creek was originally lined with mills because the creek always had a steady flow and did not freeze. Later, the mills moved to the banks of the Mahoning River. With the efforts of the dedicated visionary Volney Rogers, the entire Mill Creek Valley was set aside as a park. Picnics sponsored by the steel companies were often held in Mill Creek and other parks. The Sheet and Tube Company regularly used Campbell Park and Idora Park as sites for their social gatherings. Life seemed good in the Mahoning, providing encouragement to many new immigrants who continued to stream to the valley for nourishment, at least until the immigration laws of 1924, which effectively restricted immigration from southern and eastern Europe. The subsequent slowing of immigration and the ethnic intermarrying accelerated the Americanization process. Helpful in this process also were such local agencies as the YMCA, YWCA, Christ Mission, the International Institute, and the Hazleton Settlement, as they brought diverse people together to work and play. The Mahoning Valley was part of an important wealth-producing section of the country. It was connected to important urban areas by 4 trunkline railroads. It was within one night's ride of more than 2/3 of the nation's population and 4/5 of the country's purchasing power. It was within that area that more money was paid out in wages than any other area of the world. Industrial payrolls soared, bank deposits skyrocketed, and capital investments were brisk. By 1921, Youngstown was the second city of steel behind Pittsburgh. Youngstown's payroll exceeded $100 million. Its bank deposits were over $75 million. The steel mills alone represented capital investments of $360 million. Growth of the city seemed unstoppable. Predicting a population of 500,000 by the 1970s, the city ranked 50th in the nation by the 1920 census. It was among the fastest growing cities in the country. There were 59 miles of trolley track inside the city, and the interurban lines extended to the main cities of eastern Ohio and western Pennsylvania. The fire department was the second in the nation to be completely motorized. The Chamber of Commerce boasted that Youngstown offers unlimited opportunity to all. The 1930 census showed the city of Youngstown at its peak population of 170,000. The city would never have as high a population again, nor would the foreign-born figure be so large. Even by the end of the 1920s, the slowdown in urban growth and high prosperity was becoming evident. The movement to the suburbs, such as Austintown, Boardman, Canfield, and Poland, was beginning. The Depression of the 1930s hit the Mahoning hard. Construction plummeted, and so did the demand for steel on which the valley industries and workers depended. Many recent immigrants returned to their homelands. Joseph L. Heffernan, then mayor of Youngstown, in an article published in the Atlantic Monthly, wrote of the misery of the unemployed, who slept in culverts, in the city dump, in police stations, and under bridges. He also described the inadequacy of private charity, the inability of local government, and the indifference of the state and federal governments. Ironically, there were some businesses which flourished because of the Depression. Owners of buildings that could not be rented had them demolished to avoid paying taxes, so demolition companies did well. Old furniture could be repaired more cheaply than buying new, so furniture repair shops flourished. Second-hand stores, pawn shops, and discount houses did a thriving business. In some ways, Youngstown College can be included in this group. It flourished as a result of the depressed conditions. Middle-income parents were sending their children to Youngstown instead of away to school. The opening of the new building, now Jones Hall, in 1931, gave the college a boost in morale and a considerable amount of publicity, to say nothing about additional jobs that were provided. Less work time meant more free time. With little money, area residents turned to jigsaw puzzles, crossword puzzles, or card playing. Movie-going became a weekly event, with prices even at the newly opened Warner Theater ranging from 10 cents to 25 cents for a double feature. Or one could go to a vaudeville show at the Palace or a burlesque show at the Princess. For most people, the least expensive entertainment was the new radio stations of WKBN in 1926 and WFMJ in 1939. Dancing at the Elms or at the Idora Park or at Hamrock Hall in Kemmel was also a popular pastime for young and old. Idora Park was a great bargain. Opening in the 1890s, it was initially only a merry-go-round, a dance hall, and an outdoor theater. By the 1920s, the park had become a premier area attraction, with its large number of rides, including a challenging jackrabbit and wildcat, its wonderful French fries, cotton candy, and beautiful grounds. One could easily spend an exciting yet inexpensive day at Idora Park. Economic recovery from the Depression came very slowly. New Deal measures of Franklin Roosevelt improved conditions somewhat. Still, nearly 10 years after the Wall Street collapse, the valley had not recovered to the prosperity of 1929. Once again, we turned to the Mahoning. Hopes of building a Mahoning Beaver River Canal were high when the Army Corps of Engineers was given $5 million to begin construction by July 1st, 1935. Opponents were successful in delaying the project and finally in stopping it. Congressman Michael J. Kerwin tried unsuccessfully to revive the Mahoning project through his long career. With the beginning of World War II, everyone rushed back to work as the mills geared up for America to be an arsenal of democracy. The steel plants, as the industrial plants nationwide, expanded enormously. And this was to continue in the immediate post-war years. Everyone willing and able to work could get a job. Women replaced men in many of the jobs as they went to war. Manpower shortages also led to recruitment of more African American workers from the South. Large numbers of blacks were recruited, as during World War I, to take the dirtiest, hottest, most dangerous, and lowest paying jobs. At the end of World War II, the city of Youngstown's population was still over 2/3 of the Mahoning County total. By 1970, however, the population would decline to less than 1/2 of the county total. Industry, commerce, and peoples were flocking to the suburbs. Austintown, Boardman, Canfield, and Poland, as well as Beaver, Goshen, and New Middletown, were growing at the expense of the city. Socially, these years after World War II were marked by great stability. The traditional family prevailed. Home ownership was high. Ethnic group identity was valued, even as Americanization and tolerance of other nationalities and religions grew as the years passed. An exception was the African American population that often had difficulty in sharing of the jobs, stability, and tolerance. However, by the 1960s and 1970s, some progress was made, and the worst discrimination was outlawed. During this same period, the Valley experienced two contrasting economic developments that would significantly change Valley life. On one hand, the steel industry began to see competition from other countries and from other products that began to limit the market for local steel. On the other hand, General Motors decided to construct the huge new Lordstown Auto Assembly Plant just outside of Youngstown. Many of the second and third generation of new immigrants followed the English, German, Welsh, and others to the outlying areas. These white, middle, and upper-class residents, consciously or unconsciously, erected class and racial barriers in the suburbs, leaving the city with a largely aging, poor, and black population. The drain of money and leadership had severe consequences. Downtown Youngstown was now losing its luster. Even though Youngstown College, which became Youngstown State University by 1967, stayed and flourished, other business establishments closed downtown. By the 1970s, suburbanites chose to patronize the plazas and malls of the outlying areas rather than downtown establishments. Anchors on Federal Street closed. Banks relocated their main offices. First Federal Savings and Loan, McKelvey's and Strauss-Hirschberg's, Woolworth and McCrory's closed, as did Cliven's and Monterelli's. Livingston's, Stambaugh Thompson's, and Lustig's followed suit. The theaters closed. The State and Paramount remained closed. The beautiful Palace Theater was razed, but the Warner was saved, renamed Powers Auditorium in honor of the family who saved the building and donated it to the Youngstown Symphony Society. Today, Powers Auditorium remains an everlasting memorial to the success of an immigrant Jewish family nourished by the Mahoning. Steel mills remained as the centerpiece of the Mahoning's economy. Although continuing to provide jobs for area residents, there were indications that the mills would not prosper forever. The disadvantages of the area were beginning to outweigh the advantages. With no waterway, the dependence upon the railroads was crucial. Limited space for growth, rundown infrastructure, and loss of local control of mills all contributed to the demise of local steel by the late 1970s. Black Monday. September 19th, 1977. A day few Mahoning residents will ever forget. The closing of the Camel Works of Sheet and Tube shocked area residents. The other steel mills followed shortly thereafter. In a matter of months, the Valley steel industry collapsed, making the new GM Lordstown plant almost indispensable. Many feared the demise of the entire valley. Economic stagnation marked the valley of the 1980s and early 1990s. Former leaders avoided positions of responsibility. Potential leaders left the valley. Would our economic tensions and diminished leadership increase the possibilities of crime, of racism, of corruption? Or will the legacy of the Mahoning, which has created such rich cultures and vital institutions, continue to enrich the valley? Slowly, the Mahoning Valley began to diversify. Although some fear a new dependence upon the Lordstown automobile complex and its related industries. 2 decades after Black Monday, many signs point to the resurgence of the area. New and diverse industries are emerging. Former steel sites are filled with new businesses. Increasing commerce is evident, with vital trucking industries and expanded airport capabilities. Renewed activity in downtown Youngstown is evident. Basic institutions and enhanced cultural activity are an integral part of the valley's legacy. They remain as anchors and represent a new vitality that could nourish the valley as the Mahoning has, both symbolically and actually. These jewels of the Mahoning are many. They are products of a rich and diverse culture, whose people have enriched the valley by creating a good history, a good life, and a good future for most of us. Let's take a closer look at these well-known jewels. Youngstown State University, established in 1908 as a reading room of the YMCA. The Youngstown Institute of Technology in the 1920s. Youngstown College in the early 1930s. Youngstown University in 1955. And finally, Youngstown State University in 1967. The first building of Youngstown College, now called Jones Hall, honoring its first president, was completed in 1931. The hall was designed by architect Paul Bougero in the Jacobethian Revival style. Since then, the campus has grown to more than 40 buildings and approximately 150 acres. It now has an enrollment of nearly 13,000 and has become a premier metropolitan university. In the general vicinity of YSU, other jewels abound. The Arms Museum of the Mahoning Valley Historical Society, designed in part by Mrs. Wilford P. Arms, today is preserved as a museum with many of its main rooms filled as they were during the original occupancy in 1905. The Butler Institute of American Art. From the time of its construction in 1917 to 1919, Butler has been considered one of the finest Second Renaissance revival buildings in Ohio. It houses more than 10,000 works of American art. The Butler Institute was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1974. The McDonough Museum of Art, just across the street from the Butler, is part of YSU, and it features artwork of faculty and students. The Youngstown Historical Center of Industry and Labor explores the local iron and steel industry, labor immigration and urban history through photographs, videos, artifacts, and reconstructed scenes. Cultural activity is far from stagnant in the Mahoning. Powers Auditorium, formerly the Warner Theater, hosts classical and pops concerts performed by the Youngstown Symphony, as well as operas, choral productions, children's concerts, and traveling Broadway groups. Standing at the west end of Federal Street, Powers Auditorium is a throwback to an earlier era. Wander along the long entry foyer to the mezzanine and marvel at wood inlays of Carpathian elm, Macassar ebony, Austrian cherry, English oak and walnut, marble and mosaic tile work, Rococo plaster designs, oil paintings, and a host of chandeliers. Stambaugh Auditorium, completed in 1925, was made possible by the donation of more than $1 million from the estate of Henry H. Stambaugh. The site of concerts, plays, dances, and commencements, the historic auditorium houses an Ernest Skinner pipe organ, a ballroom, an exhibition hall, and the beautifully restored concert hall called the Marble Room. The Youngstown Playhouse, Ballet Western Reserve, the Monday Musical Club, Oakland Center for the Arts, and YSU College of Fine and Performing Arts all provide cultural enrichment for the people of the Mahoning. Mill Creek Park, established through the efforts of Volney Rogers, has become one of the premier metropolitan parks. It is home to a wildlife and waterfowl refuge area, a 36-hole golf course, paved roads for scenic drives or bike rides, venues for a host of activities, football, baseball, ice skating, and sledding. Other attractions are the highly acclaimed Fellows Riverside Gardens, the Ford Nature Education Center, Newport and Glacier Lakes, the Old Log Cabin, Pioneer Pavilion, and the Silver Bridge. Several of the buildings in the downtown area reflect the work of the Chicago School of Architecture. Others are products of P. Ross Berry or of Charles F. Owsley, both products of the Mahoning. The Mahoning County Courthouse is a historic building featuring neoclassical architecture and designed by Owsley. Two of the world's most famous mall builders have been nourished by the Mahoning and are representative of the new immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, in this instance from Italy. Edward J. DeBartolo and William Cafaro have constructed malls nationwide, with two examples on the southern fringe of the Mahoning and another in Trumbull County. Mahoning County is also the home of an infinite variety of places of worship, old and new, reflecting the waves of immigrants who have peopled the area. These varied peoples have been nourished by the Mahoning and have in turn enriched the valley. Speaking almost every language and representing almost every nationality, race, and religion, these disparate groups have each contributed to the culture. Each group has suffered hardship, humiliation, and discrimination. However, each has also had a degree of success, enjoyed progress, and contributed to the development of the jewels of the valley, and have earned a piece of the American dream. And still they come. The most recent, the Latin Americans, had come to work the steel mills in the 1950s, or in the auto plants in the 1970s. Those from the Middle East and Asia have come. Many have become business people, medical doctors, educators. How wonderful it has been to receive the nourishment of the Mahoning, and in turn to enrich the valley by the interaction with each other, learning, teaching, and developing, and recognizing how we all need each other. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the Mahoning is the bringing together of these varied waves of people, each contributing, enriching, and developing. From many, one. E pluribus unum. What the new millennium holds for the valley can only be a matter of speculation at this time. But if history tells us anything, change will come. Our hope is that change will include the renewing of leadership responsibilities so that we can correct recurring problems and build upon the richness of the Mahoning legacy. A legacy that nourishes us, not only in economic terms, but also in terms of body and spirit. In so doing, we can learn and teach as we enrich each other, our community, and our nation.